Thanks so much, Craig. Didn't you see how much he loved that? I was almost going to have to push him off the stage. It's like bad karaoke, Craig, get down. Thank you so much to be presenting on such a good topic. I grew up near the Mara mine where rehabilitation was 2 trees in a muck heap, and to see the mining caring so much and making an effort's amazing. So our next speaker is all about rehabilitation too, and I'm sure you've been really looking forward to seeing Mike. Michael Taylor is going to be presenting now about Taylor's Run. He's the 6th generation farmer on the New England Tablelands, so near Armidale in New South Wales. Importantly, he is the ABC Farmer of the Year in 2022 for his future-focused management of their diverse farm business, whilst he's been building on the agroforestry work that his family had been doing for a long time prior to that. Really interesting, beside that though, is he has a passion for whitewater rafting. So there's your conversation over lunch. Don't worry about trees and grass. Ask him about where he's floated his boat. Much more interesting. No, not much more interesting, also interesting. So I'd like you to welcome Mike to the stage. Come on up, Mike.
Wendy, it's actually kayaking, not rafting. Thank you very much for having me here today. I'd like to, just thank the reef catchments and Gilly for getting me up here. Yes, I had the spotlight shined on me last year. I'd been hiding on my farm, and this has been an exciting journey the last year. Going to lots of events, talking about our place again, but it's definitely a team effort, and like I said, many generations behind me. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land here, the Yuwi people, and pay my respects to the elders past and present. Taylor's Run is on Anaiwan land, and I'd like to pay tribute to their ongoing love of the land, love of people, and love of the high country culture. Anaiwan means high country people. Yeah, look, like I said, it's been a bit of a buzz getting up here and talking about all the things we've tried to do. Some things have succeeded and some things haven't on our farm. And like I said, 6 generations, we've had plenty of time to make lots of mistakes. It's before I sort of stepped away from talking about things a lot, I felt like I couldn't talk about managing trees anymore. People were getting a little bit over me talking about trees, and 4 or 5 years down the track, it still seems to be a very hot topic, and I'll talk a bit more about that as we go. And especially amongst graziers who are now facing more and more pressure, whether it's to do with carbon or whether it's to do with shade and shelter for their stock, or preserving biodiversity. So yes, silver pasture is still is that working? Oh, there we go. So why am I here? I'm a complete alien, it feels like, in this area. Armidale's at my farm's at a bit over 1,000 metres. We're only a few weeks off getting -5s, a month off getting -10s at night. We get between 650 and 700 mils average rainfall. During the drought, we were scraping together 200 mils of rainfall. So the field visit yesterday was incredibly different for me. I didn't recognise any of the grasses. Recognise the families, but I have visited up this way a number of times, and I know how valuable the Great Barrier Reef is, and I also know how valuable the oceans are to us. We all get a bit high and mighty up here on the land, but the ocean provides a hell of a lot of the food and the air that we breathe. So it's important that what we put into the ocean is considered. So Taylor's Run Family Farm. My family came to the New England region back in 1839. It hadn't been long before that that early European explorers had been wandering through and thought it looked pretty good for grazing animals. So we've been there, over 180 years now. I'm going to talk a little bit about growing stuff, which a lot of farmers like to do. Silver pasture, that's trees and pasture. Natural capital, some of the lessons we've learned along the way and all the challenges we've faced. And yes, I did get an award last year, but there's a hell of a lot of other Australian Farmers of the Year out there that would be just as worthy of the recognition. But it's really important we all keep sharing our stories. So 1840 to 2023. It's pretty safe to say that there was a little bit of discussion last night about what is a woodland or a grassland or a savanna with Dick. And it's made me think a little bit more, but just as we talk about agroforestry and silver pasture and agri-woodlands or engineered woodlands, the words we use in the end don't necessarily define exactly what we're doing, because it is particular to every region. When my family arrived in the area, it was classed a grassy box woodland, and the grassy part was obviously interesting to the graziers, and they thought they could create more grassland by gradually clearing out more and more timber. We were well ahead of a lot of other regions. Our climate and those grasslands made it prime conditions for grazing, and in particular superfine Merinos. The Merinos did very well on the native pastures, producing the bright white strong wool and reasonably even pasture nutrition levels throughout the year. At one stage, New England was producing 45% of the world's superfine Merino, and I believe just south of where I live are still some of the highest stocking rates Australia-wide. So despite the changes that have been made to the area, we've still managed to continue grazing at rather high rates, but the tree cover has suffered extremely. Suffered in that time. Between the 1950s and the 1970s, 80s, New England witnessed an incredible amount of dieback, which was partly sped up due to the increased stocking rates that were enabled through fertiliser inputs. Before that, there'd been some tree clearing, quite a bit of tree clearing probably, but as I've seen yesterday, trying to understand what's going on with pasture dieback, the same thing had happened with our tree dieback in the New England. So whether it's trees or pastures, New England have seen it all. And so when I hear about dieback, whether it's down in the Snowy Mountains or even in our region off to the eastern and western escarpments where development wasn't quite as high, it's something that we've been dealing with for years. So By the mid-80s, tree cover on the New England tablelands had dropped to less than 5%. I was interested to learn only recently that tree cover across the New England tablelands is still sitting at less than 5%, despite the millions of trees that have been planted through Landcare and other natural resource programs. So on our property, we've managed to bring back quite a few of those trees, and we're sitting at about 23%. So we're a little bit of a green triangle on the New England tablelands if you have a look on Google Maps. So we're also apparently sequestering nearly 200 tonnes of CO2 equivalent through on our farm through the way we're managing things. And I'll leave it open to discussion about what should be done with that carbon, whether there should be more sequestered or whether we should be sustainably utilising that for more production. So this is some aerial photography. It's been great in documenting not only the decline but also the regeneration since the mid-1980s. So you can see there some of the areas circled in red where there was quite a few trees plantings, quite a few remnant trees still back in the 50s. And if you visited our place, my grandmother always talked about being able to walk her kids, her 5 kids, down to the bus, which is our driveway's 2 kilometres long, in the shade of the trees the whole way. And so that was only when my father was at school. But in that time, all of those trees have died out. In particular, there's a little block in the top of that red circle. In 1960, my grandfather was being visited by his brother, Keith Taylor, who was an entomologist down in Canberra. He'd been doing a lot of research with Syro on the Syrex wasps that were coming and killing trees, killing radiata pines in the plantations in Tasmania. And he had done a lot of other work with insects, but they went out to have a look at, my dad was only 10, so he's standing on the back of the ute. They went out, he remembers it quite clearly, they went out to have a look at this stand of brittle gum, Michaeliana, and they were covered in scarab beetles, so the Christmas beetles, and they were stripping the leaves off the trees. And my uncle, even in 1960, said, "Oh, these beetles are going to be the death of the eucalypts in the New England." And sure enough, 25 years later, there were not many trees left. So, but it wasn't just the beetles. It was a combination of increased stocking rates, increased phosphorus levels made it difficult for a lot of the native species to regenerate. Continued clearing, and but yes, essentially a breakdown in the ecosystem. And I believe some of what what they're already finding in whether it's the dieback in the snowies or the dieback in the pastures up here is partly linked to breakages in the ecosystem. So, tree planting isn't always fun. I've been lucky in that I've just grown up with it. So I was dragged out with my sisters in the middle of winter, cold, windy, rainy days when it was barely above zero, to plant trees. But over time, my parents and now myself have looked at different ways of planting trees, and I think generally amongst farmers we always start out doing something, whether it's like mustering a difficult mob of stock across big open areas, and then suddenly discovering that you can build a laneway makes it really easy to do some of these things. So we've developed and discovered lots of different ways of planting trees to get them in cheaply and a lot quicker, and doesn't take so much away from a lot of the more current money-making parts of our business. So just like a lot of jobs, when you first approach them on the farm, can be rather labour intensive and clunky in the way that they get done. There's so many stages, and I won't try to hide the fact that planting trees is a lot more complex than just buying seedlings from the nursery and sticking them in the ground. Even I still get frustrated. Planting a few fruit trees might take a whole morning, as opposed to going out and planting 4,000 trees in a few hours on the tractor. And why does it take so long to plant just a few fruit trees when I can plant a whole forest in a morning? So my father distinctly remember one of the early pine forests I put in. I'd done all the preparation. It was one of the first ones that I designed all by myself. I picked out an area that was had fairly low grazing potential, and done all the preparation and the fencing. And we went out on that particular tractor and with the planter behind it, and we put in, it was about 3,000 trees in 4 hours, and at the end of it, Dad just casually said, "Oh, you'll get up to speed one day." So anyway. In the middle there, we're actually doing a lot of direct seeding of oaks, so oaks don't grow quite the same up here, but in our area they're quite suited. I'll talk about them more later. So innovation, to be able to plant nearly over 250,000 trees on our place since 1983. Like I said, we've tried all sorts of things. My father was quite the mechanical engineer, and despite not having studied engineering, I actually did civil engineering. I wish I'd done mechanical engineering, but he actually developed the world's first self-propelled tree planter. So up until that point, a lot of forestry, we based a lot of what we did on our neighbouring foresters in New Zealand, who were planting a lot of trees for forestry. But most of their machine planters were behind bulldozers or tractors. My father went one step further and built a completely self-propelled, dedicated tree planter. I believe that tree planter is still going in South Australia or Victoria somewhere. Just left the farm and kept going. So, yeah, unfortunate it didn't come up this way for you guys. So he also built self-propelled individually. So the one on the right, there's a skid steer operated planter. The one in the middle was one that was actually towed behind a quad bike. So with good ground prep, you're able to get a small ripper into the ground for planting the trees. So the one in the middle, being towed behind the quad, was at a little field day my parents had the idea of hosting because other farmers were wanting to learn about establishing trees on their farms. And the little field day turned into quite a large field day. By midday on that day in 1992, we'd had over 6,000 people through the gate. So it was even bigger than the field trip yesterday out to Seuss's place. We've, as I said, we've modelled a lot of our pine planting on. We don't only plant pines. It sort of seems like that at some stages, because that's what we've been getting a lot of our production out of in terms of forest products. But we modelled a lot of our what we've done on what they do, again, like I said, in New Zealand. So we started pruning quite early on and thinning our pine plantations. There were small things like thinning too early and pruning our pines too hard. Generally, pines are not considered a viable crop in rainfall areas under 700 mils. But the radiata pine was selected because of its huge range. So radiata pine is definitely the leader in terms of softwood forests in Australia. There are a number of other pine species and some cupressus that were considered and some that are still used, but radiata pine does grow from quite high rainfalls down to quite low rainfalls of 300 or 400 mil. But around that 700 mil is what was considered viable. So we've really tested our timber production from those pines. Initially, they were for shade and shelter, but as we've gone on, we've been able to start taking thinnings out. Initially, it was for the peeled logs. So all the posts on my property, treated pine posts. We've been also quite fortunate in that there's been a treatment works just down the road, about an hour down the road near Tamworth. And they've continued to operate. They did go through a few periods of being shut, but they've continued to operate. And in the current market, the very high demand of timber has meant that's been a really good path for our timber. So yeah, we didn't start milling until 2004, which was probably quite late. We probably could have started even earlier than that. But it took a bit of research and, again, a process figuring out the cheapest way to do things. We've got a portable mill. It's a Mahoe mill that we brought in from New Zealand. It's actually got twin blades. And some of you might have heard of the Lucas mill, which is an Australian-made portable mill. The Mahoe mill, we can do about double the production that a Lucas mill can in a day. And it's also run from a cable drive from one end, so it's actually quite safe. There's no walking along next to the mill. But the outlay on that mill has meant that it's been able to sit there, not having to be used 100% of the time. So yeah, up to 8 cubic metres a day, which is pretty piddly compared to some of the big softwood mills that are doing 1,000 cubic metres a day. But they're also struggling to get pine, whereas we're able to get trees from just next door. And so some of the other innovations have been in our tree planting configurations. You'll see in some photos later on, we started planting trees on fence lines initially. Then we moved to planting blocks on hilltops where the livestock were sheltering on the cold nights, up out of the frosts. We've moved to fencing up rocky areas that were very low in pasture. They've been great for growing plantation areas, but we've also fenced out areas that have become conservation areas and that are permanently or semi-permanently closed up. We've also fenced out all of our riparian zones, so we've got about 6 kilometres of creek frontage. We've fenced all of that out, and we've fenced out most of our farm dams. Initially with the farm dams, a lot of those were fenced out just with 3 or 4 strands of barb, and then during some of the tighter periods with feed, we've found that hasn't been enough to keep stock out, so we've moved to more permanent durable fencing with gates so we can let stock in and out if need be for crash grazing, or if water was getting low. We did actually, I've been through, as I said, 3 droughts. The 13-14 drought, I came within about a month of running out of water altogether for my stock. The fallback was that if I had to sell all my stock, I would have had the timber to keep producing an income from the property. So water, we don't have the deep bores that we are right up on the top of the range, and we rely heavily mostly on what falls on the surface, runs into dams or is coming down creeks. So looking after those, ensuring that they're sheltered from, they're protected from livestock, so we maintain grass and vegetation around those all the time is quite important. So as part of everything that we've done, we've also hosted lots of field days. One of those particular events that we started hosting for a few years was frog dreaming. It was a year 6 sort of age, that year 11 and 12 age group, school kids coming out. The local Landcare group had found a niche in that there wasn't a whole lot being taught in schools, and that there weren't many events for kids sort of that age to get out and learn about the environment and also connect with other people in their age group regarding learning about the environment. So the Frog Dreaming event also coincided with the 20-year anniversary of Tree Fest. So came up with the crazy idea of planting a forest in the shape of a frog. We're actually under the Armidale-Sydney flight path, so a lot of people often question what the hell is that frog in the forest doing down there. But it does get people talking. We've also put in lots of biodiversity plantings. So we get groups, whether they're bird watchers or plant collectors, coming out to see those areas. This coming weekend, we're hosting an annual oak field day. So this is oak, the Quercus species. Quercus are like the eucalypts of the northern hemisphere. They're the king of the forests. There's no Quercus species that are native to the southern hemisphere. But my parents came across those while looking into different species. We've now collected over 95 species of Quercus from around the globe. Just as farmers have been collecting species of grasses and other horticultural crops, we were collecting any trees that just would survive in our climate. Oaks have proved to be quite hardy. We lost no oaks at all during the droughts, and none fell over during the dry. We were still losing eucalypts during the drought, and quite a few eucalypts fell over during the wet. Last year, the last 6 months of last year was the wettest that my father had ever seen it on the property. For a few months there, a lot of the property was completely inaccessible. So we're hosting a field day this weekend. We'll wander around the oaks. The autumn colours are just arriving, and a lot of the acorns are ripening. So we're constantly, like I said, sharing ideas and looking for new ways, and opening our place to people. So I did mention to Dick last night he should come and run his next course on our place, and getting people there, questioning everything that we've done. We've during my time on the farm continued breaking up the farm to improve our rotational grazing, and also implementing laneways. One of the philosophies of my father was that there would never be any part of the boundary fence that couldn't be reached by crossing more than 2 gateways, and I find that's quite handy, and it does encourage you to get out. Makes it a lot easier to visit all parts of the property. Obviously, very different scale to a lot of the properties up here, especially cane farms that have no fences. That'd be amazing. But we have to keep our sheep in, and they're very good at escaping. So, I'd like to talk a little bit about quantifying the natural capital, because that is something that is happening now, that is new and exciting. The first carbon study done at our place was back actually in 1992. So not only was there no internet in 1992, but most people could never have imagined carbon or biodiversity ever being tradable commodities of any sort. But it's been well and truly shown now through detailed modelling, whether it's previous studies done under the Land, Water and Wool program back in the early 2000s, or whether it's more recently through the farm scale natural capital accounting that Latrobe University is carrying out, and going forward the Farming for the Future project, which is taking a lot of the modelling that was developed on our place and a number of other properties around the country, to move that on to modelling lots of other large and small commercial properties, trying to define what sustainable agriculture is really about. At the moment, we haven't signed up to any sort of carbon project because I'm actually selling carbon in the form of timber. So wood is around 50% carbon, and the prices I'm getting for my sawn timber are far above what the carbon market is at the moment. Plus, it hasn't locked me into any of my management practice on the place. The little animated image on the right is the growth of the carbon between 1988 and 2020. So in terms of growing carbon on farms, offsetting our emissions, trees are the low-hanging fruit. There's a lot of talk about soil carbon and grass, but as far as I know, most of us are using that to produce meat. So there's still a question to be discussed around how much of that soil carbon could be kept back with it if it's not being paid for or not being turned into another usable product. So farmers are business executives. We all know this in Australia, where we're, second to New Zealand in terms of the lowest government subsidies. So farmers in Australia generally have to be pretty shrewd when it comes to running their businesses, especially during droughts or difficult market times. When my parents realised they needed to start revegetating the farm, it had to be an economic decision. It couldn't be just to satisfy the greenies or satisfy some government regulation, or it had to be something that would make a difference to the bottom line. So it was really important that they weren't reducing their production capacity, and they've managed to do that through managing the way they've planted the trees and also looking, like I said, for cheaper and more efficient ways of getting trees in the ground. I just pull myself up there. I keep saying planting trees, and I realise, again, you guys still have the ability to regenerate from the natural remnant vegetation up here. So when I'm talking about growing trees, I'm also talking about managing trees. And we do get that a lot, that managing the tree cover on your place is important too. And again, finding the most efficient ways to do that. And there's really no limit to how you might do that in your local area. But again, finding the most efficient ways is really important to keeping our businesses viable. So during a number of years there, my parents were planting up to 20,000 trees a year. We've reined that in a little bit, and it's more, but usually between 2,000 and 4,000 a year. But it's important that you don't bite off more than you can chew. In the time since my parents started planting trees, seedlings have risen nearly tenfold in cost, and obviously fuel's gone up and labour's gone up, and it's not. But we're not limited to the species that we choose, so we've been looking for still, again, more species. But it's really important that the short-term benefits are recognised. So initially, for my parents, the realisation was the need for shelter for our sheep during the cold winters, and especially sheep off shears. In particular, people ask me, well, give me an example. And a few years ago, off shears, we'd shorn about 1,200 lambs, and a neighbouring property had shorn a similar amount. And it was a cold, rainy winter's evening, and I have a tree reserve that I run my weaners into off shears. We're still actually using flat combs. A lot of the producers on the tablelands have moved to cover combs, which leave more wool on the sheep because of the cold winter conditions. We shear generally during the end of winter, because that's when we're getting the calmer, drier days. We don't get so many rainy days, but it still does happen. That particular night I was sure I would lose quite a few weaners. I went out in the morning. I think I'd lost one or two. They were probably ones that were being naturally selected out anyway. Our neighbours lost over 300 lambs on that same night, and like I said, they're using cover combs. So when people ask me about the economic benefits, that's just one of many examples we're able to give. Bring natural capital and carbon and all those other things into the mix, and it's starting to look a lot more interesting, especially as a business. So whether it's saving lambs, producing timber, selling logs, or producing sheep, meat, cattle as well, obviously these are all things that are really important. So talking about costs, so back in the 80s, pine seedlings were around the 10 to 15 cents a seedling. Same seedlings now around $1.50, $1.80 from the large forestry nurseries that are available to us. We've gradually had to move further and further afield as a lot of those nurseries have become conglomerated. We were able to originally buy our seedlings from just down the road in Walker. It's only 20 k's away. Not long into planting pines, 5-10 years down the track, we were buying them out of forest nursery in the Snowy Mountains. And then I've been buying most of my pine seedlings out of Colac in Victoria. And then I found out recently they're not doing bare root anymore, and I'd have to go to South Australia. I was recently presenting over in Western Australia, and apparently they're giving away seedlings over there. So I'm trying to figure out how to get pine seedlings from Western Australia now back. So if there's any nurseries up here, anyway. We've been planting a lot of cuttings, so poplar and willow cuttings. There's a lot of natives grow from cuttings as well, but poplar and willow cuttings, again, were something that were readily accessible and easy to practically free to harvest and plant. Now, of the 3,000 trees I'm putting in this year, most of those will be oaks. And there was an earlier photo there. The acorns from the oaks are quite large. They're a live seed. We take them straight off the tree and straight in the prepared seed bed. And we're covering them with a little bit of sawdust from our sawmill. So maybe you guys could use cane mulch for doing something the same. We're finding the oaks are also growing just as quick as a lot of the eucalypts. I had oaks last year that had 1.8 metre long shoots on, which is almost like tropical growth. Grazing integration. So I know the hot topic here is grazing, and I'm happy to continue talking about this. I won't be able to cover everything, but like I said, integrating our tree planting program with our grazing has been really important. Originally, we were, like I said, closing up small areas, taking stock right out of the equation, and letting those trees fully establish into 5-10-year-old trees. But we've found since trying to cover larger and larger areas, get more and more trees in the ground, we've taken to re-fencing whole paddocks. So the project I've got this year is a full 14-hectare paddock, and it'll take a little bit longer than establishing eucalypts or pines or some of the faster growing species because they're mostly oaks. But within 4 or 5 years, we'll be back to crash grazing those paddocks. With the pines and the eucalypts, we find often during winters in the first 2 or 3 years, we can start to get stock of particular types back in there and crash grazing those for whether it's for a few hours or for a whole day even, depending on the trees and the feed situation across the property. But generally, most of those areas benefit also from being closed up. So Dick was talking about big changes, and that's something we do a lot on our place, is big changes, including closing areas up for extended periods of time, or grazing areas down, or overgrazing areas before we might have a tree planting program. But we find those big changes definitely encourage biodiversity in our pastures. And these days, on average, we can find over 40 species of annuals and perennials, natives and naturalised species across our pastures. So there's a map of our place. Livestock will graze any trees, so don't imagine that there's a magic tree out there that the livestock won't graze. And if they don't graze it, they'll rub against it, they'll trample on it, or they'll get someone else to graze it for them. So managing your grazing around those. I know that Rowan Reid, who is well known for his agroforestry demonstrations, uses tall plastic tree guards on a flexible stake that does allow browsing animals to walk around and knock those trees around without actually damaging the trees. But we've found in our particular area the trees often overheat in those plastic tubes. So finding solutions again that are suitable to your area is really important. Trialling guards can be one way, but the guards are often quite expensive. My father's taken to, more recently, we've been building individual tree guards, reusable tree guards, for establishing just some paddock trees across our place, which seems like a bit of a step back. But again, as I said, they're reusable tree guards, so once the trees have reached a height above grazing, we're able to remove those, but again, we're engineering exactly where we want those trees. So something I've done is been planting trees around all our sheep yards, try and get a bit more shade in there during summer. So, as I said, we've had lots of field days onto the place and events, and education and extension is a really big part of what we do. Learning again from our mistakes. I've done a number of presentations just focusing on the mistakes that we've made on the farm. Things have changed so much over time. Access to information, transport, all these things have evolved over time. Ongoing management is a really important part of the tree growing, tree management that we do on our place. So across a lot of the New England, there was a lot of tree planting done in the 1990s. But a lot of those trees were put in and totally forgotten. And I'm pretty sure if you were told to plant a crop and just forget about it for the next few months until everything ripened, most people growing their cane, I'm sure, do some sort of management in that time in preparation for harvest. So we've always had, obviously with trees, the goals are a lot more distant. Markets can change, technology can change, distances to processing can change, so many things can change from the time you plant trees to the time you potentially harvest them. But it's really important having a goal, and even more important now that where a lot of the forestry industry, a lot of the pricing around, whether it's timber or logs, it's quite difficult still to get information. So we're doing a lot of work with big forestry at the moment to try and make that a lot more transparent. When you're selling your cattle, you can sell one calf or you can sell 1,000 cows, and you usually have a pretty good idea of what you're going to get at the sale yards. and often you can nearly figure out how much the person that buys them is going to make as well. In forestry, we did our first major log harvest last year, and 7 weeks after the trees had been harvested, I still didn't know how many logs had left the property. I didn't know when I was going to get paid, or what I was going to get paid, or what quality all the logs had been classed. So there's still quite a few hurdles there when it comes to wholesale log sales, which is why we've pulled back and we're doing a lot more milling of our timber on farm. We can mill that timber and we know at a retail price exactly what and how much we're going to sell. So, but like I said, having an ongoing management program towards an end goal is really important, whether that's for biodiversity, timber, or shelter. Maybe you only need to get your trees this high to get the shelter. So rather than trees, maybe you should be looking at shrubs or something. Or maybe you want to get your trees high up out of reach purely for shade. And so it doesn't matter what your end goal is, it's important to think about what it is and how you're going to get there, and continually work towards that. Little bit more on extension that we've done. The Master Tree Growers course is a great course to do if you're looking for learning more about managing trees. Master Tree Growers course was developed by Rowan Reed and the Australian Agroforestry Foundation, and they developed that program to suit wherever they deliver it. So when they bring it to our area, obviously it was very different to when they deliver it throughout Southeast Asia or over in Western Australia in the grain cropping belt. So from the Master Tree Growers course, there's also been a lot of peer group mentoring that's come out of that. It's very easy to get to pay a lot of money for a contractor or a consultant to come in and tell you what to do on your place, but often they don't always take into account of what your goals or what your interests are. So peer group mentoring has meant when we go out in our region, there's never less than 3 people go out to a property. So we're always sharing ideas and actually trying to really understand what the landholders are wanting. So it's probably something worth thinking about. I think it's a model that would even work quite well in whether it's in the cattle industry or cropping or sheep. So I know that when you are looking for information, you'll know that such and such is really good at machinery, and you'll give him a call and ask, what machines he's using, or if I've got some issue with my cattle, some disease has popped up. There's always the vet, but there's often a neighbour that you might have heard of that is quite good at identifying these things. So it's really important, again, to keep bringing your peers together and mentoring each other in the process. Resilience. As I said, I've survived in only 19 years. I've been through 3 droughts. The first drought, luckily, I snuck off overseas for a year to France with my wife's French, and it was after shearing. My dad had said, I'll caretake the place for you if you leave after shearing and you get back before shearing. And not long after shearing, we were getting photos of red sheep, all the dust that was coming in from out west. And within a couple of months, our second block that my sister's now on, we've improved the water situation there now, but that block had actually run out of water completely. We had to destock it. So, but then 2013-14 came around, and like I said, I tried to manage too many stock through that drought, tried to feed too many. I was doing containment feeding and everything that was considered to be the right thing. I was going to keep those stock, and the drought was going to break. Unfortunately, it nearly broke me before the drought broke, and like I said, we came within a month of running out of water completely. And then 2018-19 came around, and on the back of nearly 6 years of below average rainfall, we got a record dry. That was probably in the 180 years, my family being there, was the driest we've ever seen it. So our creek was dry for a couple of years, and it's flowed continuously for the last 2.5 years. Everybody around us was shipping in feed from further and further afield. It was pretty amazing to see the amount of feed coming all the way from WA. People hanging on to their stock. I'd vowed after the last drought never to hand feed again. We came pretty close. I had to hand feed a few pregnant ewes for a couple of months towards the end, but most of the farmers in the region had been hand feeding for a couple of years. So it is possible. It was also incredible to see how a lot of the native species were performing during that dry time. We'd get 0.5 mil of rain, and most places that would just evaporate instantly. That small amount of rain was being turned into green shoots, and I'm sure on the western side of the range up here you would be familiar with that, the incredible tenacity of some of those drought-hardy, dry-hardy species. So, but again, having the timber business to fall back on, if I had to sell all my stock or reduce them elsewhere, I had more than enough trees. The pastures might have been short and green under them, but I had more than enough trees on our place to continue bringing in an income during those times. And that was a huge relief. So whether it's too wet or too dry, or the markets have slumped, having those alternative incomes it definitely builds resilience. You'd all know about water erosion up here. We don't have quite the issue with water erosion, but wind erosion definitely. A lot of people forget how important trees are, and just reducing the wind speed by a couple of kilometres an hour. A lot of good land managers had maintained a lot of their ground cover in their pastures during the drought, but the small amount of litter and dry grass that was left was usually stripped bare in the end by just due to the wind. And even some of our more hardy pastures probably would have suffered a lot more if it hadn't been for the tree shelter just dropping the wind a few kilometres an hour and stopping the erosion. So the amount of dust that we harvested over that time was probably quite impressive. It was just day after day of dust storms. So I can imagine that's probably hard to comprehend in Mackay, but again, not far over the range. I'm sure you've seen a lot drier times. So there was some discussion before about why farmers are not changing, and Dick has a quote on the other side there, a little bit to do with that. I do a little bit of whitewater kayaking, as Wendy mentioned, and when you first start out, it can be quite scary, even the small whitewater, especially when you know that a metre by a metre of water is a tonne of water, and if that's pinning you and your boat against a tree or a rock, it can be incredibly scary. Very much like my parents probably felt when they first decided they were going to revegetate the place. If somebody had told them they had to plant 250,000 trees to only get the place to 23% tree cover, I think they might have freaked out and sold up the farm then. But little bit by bit, drip by drip, you build your skills over the years, and I'm sure we've all seen that. And before you know it, you're running 15-metre waterfalls, and it's just another step in the journey down the river. So your skills build along the way with the size and complexity of the rivers you choose, and also of the management practices on your farm. So what might seem impossible at the beginning becomes second nature. I'm also a little bit of a fan of Dr. Seuss. I've got 3 kids, and I was never much of a book reader, but reading Dr. Seuss always made storytelling fun. And looking back now, he actually made some good points about sustainability. The story of the Lorax, a lot of people compare me to the Lorax on the right there. Speak for the trees. It's a fable that pits capitalism against biodiversity. It's a sobering tale of the avaricious onceler who's seduced by wealth, fells all the yarn-producing truffler trees to knit lucrative needs. As the forests and wildlife crumble and disappear, the Lorax, who speaks for the trees, pleads for the preservation of his ecosystem. It's really interesting that at the end of the story, it's actually the capitalist, the onceler, that gives us hope and says, unless someone like you cares a whole awful lot, nothing is going to get better. It's not. So as he hands over the last remaining truffler seed. So I'm a farmer amongst many others, another of Dr. Seuss's story about too many Daves, but I don't believe there can be too many Daves, and I believe we can continue having viable, vibrant businesses whilst also conserving our natural capital and improving the bottom line. So what are you going to manage? What tree are you going to manage next? So there's no simple answers, just good questions. And again, that's why we're all here today. And maybe, is that a giant frog forest? So thank you very much again, Reef Catchments, for having me here. And yeah, bring on the questions.
Hello?
Any questions?
No, none.
Yes, Michael. A couple of questions. One is, how do you split your time now between forestry and grazing? And through your journey, other than the droughts, of course, are your stock numbers increasing as you create more shelter belts?
I'd say our profitability has diversified and improved. I'd spend probably, I'd say 95% of my time on the grazing enterprises, and a very small part on the forestry. To establish the 3,000 trees that we're putting in this year, it'll probably be about 3 or 4 days of fencing. But you could probably split that between tree establishment and grazing. I'm extending a laneway. I'm creating another paddock for management. Ground prep, we'd be talking about probably a day and a half, 2 days. And tree planting, probably push out to maybe 4 or 5 days, so to put all those trees in. And As I said, most of those are oaks, so it's taken me 2 or 3 hours to collect all the acorns. The native seedlings are going to be more expensive, despite getting a grant for a lot of those. The native seedlings are getting close to, the $2 a seedling now. So, and that's for larger numbers. But it would be mostly the labour. So for those 1,000 seedlings, it would still only it would be a full day's worth of a full 8 or 9 hour day of tree planting to get those 1,000 in. So the radiata pines have been a lot cheaper because we were able to plant them and we don't put any tree guards on them at all. We don't milk cartons or there's no mulch. And the bare roots were the best. They go straight into the ground. We're putting them in when they're relatively dormant in July, August, and then they just start growing. So timing your tree planting with rain, is a bit of a juggle, but so is bringing the sheep in to do something, or bringing the cattle in, or, well, you guys don't worry about the rain up here, but yeah, I'm probably not as waterproof as you guys, so I have to make sure it's nice and dry, except when I'm planting trees, and then I'll go out, and that's actually a job I can do on a rainy day, is planting the trees. So yeah, really it's not much more than a big veggie garden, the amount of time you'd put into it.
Hello. Oh, there we go. A bit closer. Michael, a few people around here are dabbling in native fruit trees as well. Little bespoke markets and that down in Sydney and Brisbane and Melbourne. Have you... am I asking the wrong person again?
Yeah.
Have I got a habit of that?
I've got a friend here that would know a lot more about that, actually.
But have you done any... I suppose, first question to you, have you done anything yourself? And then I'll pass the mic.
We have actually, as part of the journey, my parents were looking for, again, cheap trees anywhere, and they came across the rootstock market for fruit trees. So in our area, pears and apples, obviously in gardens and all the ones that have been planted around our place, noticed that they were quite hardy, and my parents came across the rootstock market. So at the end of nurseries producing all the seedlings for orchards, the rootstock that had been grown from seed was discarded or sold cheaply. So they actually, I think that's changed a little bit, because I did look into it a couple of years ago, and I was a bit taken aback by the price of rootstock. So obviously it's caught on. And so along our riparian area along the creek, we do actually have a lot of apple trees, and now in good years we have more apples. We have enough for the birds, we have enough for the flies, we have enough for whatever else is going to eat them, and there's usually more than we can eat as well. So, but yeah, I definitely don't want to be an orchardist. It's there's been enough years too when I've seen the apple trees drop all their apples come Christmas time. There's like, that's it, it's too hard, drop all their apples. So yeah, there's always options if you're in a situation where you could irrigate those through those dry times, do it on a different scale. I know that the few orchards left in our area are fully netted and protected, and I don't want to know what else they have to do to keep the apples clean. But that would be up to an organic grower to answer those questions. But yeah, I know up in this area there's some people doing.
Any other questions? He just wants me to answer his question. So I grow a range of native citrus, so finger limes, but predominantly the CSIRO hybrids that were developed in, I think, the 1970s. So your Australian blood lime, your Australian desert lime, your Australian sunrise lime. Domestic market access is poor unless you process. So I export everything to China and America. With the, for example, finger limes, which is a popular one at the moment, South America has the largest market share for Australian finger limes. So if you're going to go down that path, it's viable, it's profitable, it's very relatively low inputs. The most expensive aspect is actually buying the tree stock, but you need to consider your markets. Don't throw it in there and expect there's going to be a market there. I had to spend a lot of time developing the American pharmaceutical market for the raspberries and the Chinese market for the blood limes. Carlos?
Thanks for your presentation, Michael. Really good. Beautiful photos, beautiful work you and your family been doing over time. I just wanted to have a little bit more understanding. What's that? You said you're planting 3,000 seedlings this year. What's that first year of management look like for those seedlings? Do you have to revisit the site monthly, every 3 months? Do you have to water, brush cut? Do you use chemicals? What's the process?
No, I was talking to somebody about this before. I'm actually, I'm not probably as good at growing things as some people are. So we generally, and I know my parents are the same, so it's not just me, but we generally plant an excessive number very cheaply so that we don't actually have to go back at all. We can afford that 5, 10, 15, 20% losses, and we're still left with a lot of trees. So our first few plantings we were putting in of oaks, we were putting in 2 or 3 acorns in each plot, and all of them grew. So now we've got all these, 3 or 4 stemmed oaks of different varieties. So we're getting a little bit better at, figuring out densities and whatever. But like I said, even with the pines, when we first started out, we were planting them further apart, and then we were thinning them too soon, and we were actually pruning them too hard. We were cutting off their solar panels for growth, and that was setting them back. So we moved to planting them closer, waiting longer before we thin them, and then pruning them later. So again, depending on your environment, that's going to change, and depending on the time and access to labour, and so we've been able to get in some labour for the pruning, but I've had to do quite a bit myself. So talking about time, I talked about establishment time.